For those of you who don't know me, my name is Wendy Musumeci, and I am the Easement Program Coordinator at the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. In addition to negotiating new easements, I am also the Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund Grant Program Administrator. And during the workshop today, I intend to broadly cover the history of the fund, how the department administers the program, some specific information on the 2026 grant round, as well as the application form. As a bit of a disclaimer, the materials presented today are for informational purposes and may not comprehensively reflect all the grant program requirements. I tried to get everything in there, but we encourage you also to carefully read the grant manual and associated documents before you submit an application. As I mentioned, we'll do a question and answer period at the end. However, feel free to ask questions in the chat in the interim, especially if it relates to a specific section I've just covered. So first, I want to start with an overview of our current grant round. Combined with $372,324 remaining from the fiscal year 2026 grant round, the total amount available for our current fiscal year grant cycle is up to $5,622,324. Projects funded by the Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund do not have a minimum or maximum award dollar amount. We also sometimes award partial funding for a project. A calendar of some of our important dates for the grant cycle is shown on the screen. Keep in mind that the deadline for the August 17th Easement Acceptance Committee meeting is July 17th. I will explain this in more detail on a following slide, but broadly speaking, as a heads up, an easement application for the project property must be submitted and reviewed by our Easement Acceptance Committee at least once in order to apply for a Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund grant. And I will just also to let you know, I'm sometimes going to refer to the Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund as VBPF for short. So applications to the VBPF are due in the online web grants portal by 5 p.m. on Tuesday, September 1st, 2026. There have not been significant changes to the application form and overall program administration since last year. However, I want to highlight a few important items. The scoring will continue to prioritize Revolutionary War battlefields as we are in the semi-sesquicentennial year of 2026. However, the scoring also will prioritize project readiness. And project readiness will be demonstrated through things like the Easement Acceptance Committee and Board of Historic Resources review of the associated easement application, but also completion of due diligence requirements, securing of match funding, and alignment with state and local plans. As I previously mentioned, an easement application form must be submitted and reviewed by DHR's Easement Acceptance Committee at least once prior to submission of the VBPF application. Additionally, no applications can be accepted for fee simple acquisition projects or acquisitions of land that occurred prior to September 1st, 2025. No more than 2 applications can be submitted for the same parcel of land across grant cycles. Another important requirement is that at least 50% of the property be within the battlefield boundaries. And if funds are awarded, you will be required to submit 2 progress reports per year. Projects must be completed, including recordation of the associated easement within 3 years from the date of the grant agreement, and 1 12-month extension may be granted. I also wanted to share a really brief overview of the origins of the Battlefield Fund and how it has developed. In 2006, the Virginia Appropriations Act set out funding for battlefield preservation, which at that time was allocated on a yearly basis. In 2010, the fund was formally codified in Virginia Code. It was first known as the Civil War Sites Preservation Fund. The scope of the program was expanded in 2015 to include Revolutionary War and War of 1812 battlefields, in addition to Civil War battlefields. At that time, the fund was also renamed the Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund. Established in Virginia Code Section 10.1-2202.4, the Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund is a non-reverting fund. Its purpose is to award competitive grants to nonprofit organizations for the fee simple acquisition of an easement on Virginia battlefield land. This includes Revolutionary War, War of 1812, or Civil War battles. The fund is administered by the Department of Historic Resources, which is charged with creating guidelines for applications, evaluations, and award of grants. The Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund is administered specifically by DHR's easement program with assistance from our Financial Services Division. We also have a review panel that consists of agency employees as well as outside experts in the field. Since 2006, DHR has awarded roughly 162 grants, ranging from $16,000 to over $1 million each. Nearly $32 million in grant funds have been allocated in total, and that protects more than 11,500 acres of Virginia battlefield land. As I previously noted, DHR is responsible for administration of the fund. However, the enabling legislation, that section of the Virginia Code, really lays out the framework for how the fund is structured and how we administer it. There are 4 basic elements to the program. Applicants must be registered nonprofit charitable corporations, and there are 2 project types, as I mentioned. That includes fee simple acquisition of land or acquisition of a historic preservation and open space easement on land. To be eligible, the land must be within the designated boundaries of a Revolutionary War, War of 1812, or Civil War battlefield, as identified in 2 separate federal reports, which I'll provide more detail on. Dollar for dollar matching funds are required. Eligible applicants must be registered nonprofit charitable corporations declared exempt from taxation pursuant to the United States Code. Applicants must submit certain authorization documents for their associated organization. This includes a letter from the IRS verifying the organization's 501c3 status, current within 3 years. And that is a change from last year's program. We were requiring that IRS letter to be current within 1 year, but we have extended that to be current within 3 years. We also asked for a W-9 form, certificate of good standing from the Virginia Corporation Commission. That must be current within 1 year, and copies of your organization's bylaws and articles of incorporation. These documents only need to be provided once per organization. If you are submitting multiple application forms, you only need to provide them once. Information about how to obtain that IRS affirmation letter and the Virginia SCC certificate is available online, and the links are provided in this presentation, which I will also share with you all afterward. These same links are also in the grant manual. If you do decide to apply for the VBPF grant program and you cannot get your IRS affirmation letter by the application deadline, please let me know. We can provide flexibility with this requirement, especially if for any reason there is an extended wait time with the IRS. So don't stress that too much. Just reach out to me and I will work with you to help you get what we need. There are only 2 eligible project types, as I've mentioned. That's acquisition of land and fee, or acquisition or purchase of an easement. Grant fund monies cannot be used for projects such as restoration of the landscape to day of battle conditions, demolition and removal of non-historic buildings, interpretation or planning projects, or material stabilization of buildings and structures. Applicants must provide documentation that the owner is willing to sell the subject property or convey an easement on it. This can be demonstrated through a purchase and sale contract or a signed and dated letter from the property owner indicating their intent to sell the property or to convey the easement. If there are multiple owners, all owners or ownership entities must sign the letter. Importantly, applicants may submit a VBPF application for the same parcel of land only twice. And that can be, across grant cycles, but only twice for the same parcel of land. This next section is some specific requirements that are associated with the fee simple projects. And for fee simple projects, prior acquisitions of land are eligible, provided that they occurred no more than 12 months before the application deadline. So there is a 12-month look back period for prior acquisitions, and this is taken directly from our enabling legislation. So this year's cutoff date for prior acquisitions will be September 1st, 2025. Additionally, for a prior acquisition to be eligible, the applicant must demonstrate that an identified threat to the property or a compelling preservation purpose existed at the time, that the property is not publicly owned or protected for purposes consistent with the Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund, and it is not already encumbered by a permanent protective easement for historic preservation and open space purposes. Applications for properties already protected for conservation purposes are generally not eligible for a VBPF grant unless the property can be further protected by a more restrictive easement. The grant amount in that case would be dependent on the value of the enhanced protections as determined by a qualified appraiser. Eligible properties include those identified in either the report to Congress on the historic Revolutionary War and War of 1812 sites in the United States, or the report on the nation's Civil War battlefields. These reports delineate specific battlefields, sites, and boundaries, and the Civil War battlefield report specifically designates core and study areas. The reports are available through the National Park Service's data store website. And again, I've included the links here. Those are also in our 2026 grant manual. And DHR's online database, VCRIS, which I think some of you are probably familiar with, that also contains the boundaries of all of the battlefields as provided by the National Park Service. Importantly, for the Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund, at least 50% of the property's acreage must be within the boundaries of the battlefield as defined in the reports. If you are not certain whether a specific property falls within the boundaries of a given battlefield, please reach out to me or to our department's archives division, and I will provide contact information at the end of the presentation for our archives division, but you can also reach out to me, and if I can't answer that, I will also send you to archives to help determine how much of the property or whether the property is eligible and falls within the boundaries as identified in these reports. Some associated requirements with the fund. All recipients of a Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund grant must provide at least $1 in matching funds for every $1 in grant funds received. Matching funds can be cash and the value of any contribution from a bargain sale or donation of land or interest in land made by a property owner. The grant manual contains additional information on the requirements for any property used as match. I encourage you to read through that if you plan to use a match property as part of your project. Importantly, and this is somewhat unique to this particular grant program, other state funds cannot be used as match. For most projects, we typically see American Battlefield Protection Program, battlefield land acquisition grants used as match. We sometimes also see the donative value used as match. You must submit a letter with your application confirming the match will be met and specifying the source of the match funds to be used. In some cases, as you know them at the time of the application, and the question will ask you to specify whether you have applied for that match, whether it's been dispersed or in hand, so that we can have a also a sense of where you are in the process of meeting the match requirement. Grants from the fund cannot exceed 50% of the appraised value of the land and any improvements or the value of the easement interest to be acquired. Again, this is taken directly from our enabling legislation. The value must be substantiated by an appraisal that meets USPAP standards and is completed within 6 months of closing. A full appraisal report is not required at the time of submission of an application, but it is encouraged. You can also submit a preliminary appraisal report. If you are awarded funds, please be aware that DHR may request, in certain circumstances, an appraisal update or appraisal review as applicable. Because grants from the fund may only be up to 50% of the appraised value, due diligence costs are generally not reimbursable, except for limited circumstances when the actual cost to acquire the property or the easement interest is less than 50% of the appraised value. And that's a really unique, that would be a sort of a unique circumstance, such as if the property were donated to you as the applicant organization and you had no acquisition costs. In that situation, the due diligence costs up to 50% of the appraised value would be reimbursable. For all projects, a perpetual historic preservation and open space easement over the subject property must be conveyed to the Virginia Board of Historic Resources. Easements held by the board are administered by staff, the easement program staff at the Department of Historic Resources. The legislation does lay out some parameters for holders other than the board. In these instances, the terms and conditions of the easement must be reviewed by DHR to ensure it accomplishes the perpetual preservation of the property. The other holder shall also demonstrate that it has the capacity and the expertise to manage and enforce the terms of the easement. For fee simple acquisition projects, the required easement must be recorded before the property is subsequently conveyed or transferred. Additionally, any encumbrances proposed to be recorded or work proposed to be done during the open grant period must be reviewed and approved in advance by DHR. And those last two are, in the event that you are awarded funds, those are some of the requirements that will come along with that. I just also wanted to take a moment to note that the primary purpose of the easement will be to comprehensively protect all the historic resources on the property. The easements in our program prioritize historic conservation values such as the architectural, archaeological, battlefield, and landscape qualities of a given property. But there are many other important conservation values that can be identified and protected in the easement, such as those associated with water quality, natural heritage resources, forests, agricultural properties, or open space land. The list on this slide is not all encompassing, but gives you an idea of the types of resources that may be present, and DHR will, in most circumstances, try to seek to protect these resources in the easement. The grant manual also contains a detailed description of the standard provisions that will be included in the easement. There are a few other requirements I wanted to highlight. The first is related to what we, broadly refer to as the comprehensive plan. All applicants, as part of your application, you must submit a letter or correspondence from the locality in which the subject property is located, indicating that perpetual protection of the property as open space conforms to the locality's comprehensive plan. Projects that do not conform at the time of the grant application will not be funded. If awarded funds, the recipient must also meet the requirements of DHR's easement program. This includes procurement of a current within 1 year, boundary survey of the project property, and obtaining a title policy that ensures the Commonwealth of Virginia Board of Historic Resources as the easement holder. The funds enabling legislation drives the primary scoring criteria. This includes the historic significance of the battlefield and how much of the subject property falls within the core and study areas. Other factors include the property's proximity to conserved lands, threats to the property, the financial and administrative capacity of the applicant to complete the project, and plans to make the property accessible to the public and provide an associated public interest. A detailed scoring rubric is included as Appendix 1 of the grant manual. It includes all the ranking criteria and possible points that may be awarded for each category. Please be aware that there is also a qualitative component to the scoring. The review panel will consider factors such as public access, community impact, the proposed easement provisions, plans for the applicant's long-term stewardship of historic resources on the property, the applicant's prior performance managing a VBPF grant, including timely closeout of grant agreements and projects, and whether the application clearly indicates why this property or this project is important to the applicant. Before we move on, I guess, Carrie, are there any questions I can address now, or should I keep
this right now?
I'm sorry?
No questions right now.
No questions. Okay. Next, I'm going to sort of shift gears a bit and talk to you a little about web grants. As some of you may know, all DHR's grant applications must be submitted through the web grants online grant management system. Other state agencies have also been using this system. So some of you know it from the Virginia Land Conservation Foundation. Also the Department of Forestry and the Virginia Outdoors Foundation use web grants as well. So before going over the application itself, I thought I would just take a few minutes to review some of the basic functions of web grants and give you a quick sense of how to start an application. We have also created a detailed step-by-step instruction document on how to use web grants specifically to the Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund application, and that is available with our other program materials, which I'll show you how to access. And I will share this presentation, as I mentioned, as well as that instruction document with everyone who attended the webinar. But also, please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any specific web grants questions should you decide to apply and run into any difficulties. So as I mentioned, your application must be submitted through the Web Grants online grant management system. I know we have some returning customers today who have used the system and worked through it last year or have used it for other grant programs at the state level. But to quickly orient you, DHR's Web Grants landing page is vadhr.webgrantscloud.com. And the associated URL for that landing page is available at the top of the screen here. When you navigate to that page, if you click on the blue link on the page, which I have highlighted here with an arrow, it will bring you to a list of all DHR's current funding opportunities. So if for any reason your organization is interested in other DHR grant programs beside the Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund, whatever grant programs are currently open will be shown in this storefront area of our main Web Grants portal. Clicking on an individual posted link here, I've highlighted the Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund. If you click on that row, it will bring up a page with detailed information about the grant program and the current opportunity. At the bottom of this screen, if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, there are also links to the various documents that are associated with this opportunity. You can individually download those documents and materials from this page. So I took this screenshot from what we have currently posted, which includes the grant manual, the sample application form in PDF and Word format, but also that scoring and review criteria document. As I mentioned, the step-by-step instructions on how to complete a Web Grants application. And also for those of you who haven't registered, if for any reason you need to, there's also an instruction document for that. I think I don't know, I can't remember if I have this in later, but if you registered in Web Grants last year or for our program, there's no need to register again. You're already in the system. Once you have navigated to DHR's grant portal landing page, you can log in with your user ID and password if you have previously registered. And if not, as I just mentioned, you can click on that yellow button that says click here to register. If you need assistance with registration, please contact me. And again, that step-by-step instruction guide is also available on the main landing page. If you already have an account and you're having difficulty, you can also reach out to me if you're having difficulty logging in. I can help get you your user ID associated with your account, and if for any reason you also need to reset your password. Once you log in, you want to navigate to the funding opportunities section on the left-hand menu, which is shown here on the left side of the screen, and then select the Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund opportunity by clicking on it. And again, you're going to see all of DHR's open funding opportunities on this page. So make sure you click on the Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund. Read the full description to ensure you understand all of the eligibility requirements, most of which I've just gone over here today. And again, even when you go in to start an application, you will still have the ability to download and review any of those associated program materials. They are attachments at the bottom of this funding opportunity page. Any document here can be downloaded. After you review the description and you are ready to start an application, you just scroll back to the top of this page, and there are 3 ways to either start a new application or access one you've already started. You can copy an application from a past grant round, and that's seen in the blue box on the screen here labeled A. You can also start a brand new application, as that's shown in the green box labeled B, or you can edit an existing application from the current grant round that you started during a past session, and that is shown here in the yellow box labeled C. We generally recommend starting a new application using that green link rather than copying an old one, because the application form has changed a bit. So if you copy the old one, it might not line up exactly with the new form. Particularly this year, and I'll share that in a bit, we've changed the budget section. And so if you try to open that prior application and use it, it's not going to line up exactly. One alternative that you can consider is if you open a prior application from last year in one window and then start a new application in another window, you could potentially copy paste back and forth between those two. We strongly encourage you in general to work separately in either the PDF or the Microsoft Word versions of the application that we have available on that main funding opportunities page, and answer your questions in the Word document first, and then copy paste those into web grants as you go. That way you have your work saved separately should anything happen in web grants, so you don't lose any material, and you can always go back to your Microsoft Word version, edit that, and move that information over into web grants. Once you complete the initial application setup, so you've clicked that green link, you're starting a new application, it's going to ask you some questions about the application. Once you start that and move to the next screen, you're going to get a list of application components, and they're all shown on this screen here. There are 13 total components in the application form, and all of those must be completed before you can submit your application. Each time you fully complete a component, a green check mark will appear, which is, those check marks are shown in the red rectangular box on the screen. All of the components, as I mentioned, have to be completed before the system will let you submit your application, which is the orange button in the center of the screen there. And just a few other sort of things that are important to know. After you complete an individual component or an individual form within a component, you want to click the Mark as Complete button, that is the orange button. And even if you mark a form as complete, you can still go back at a later time and edit that form again. So if you've answered the questions and you click on Mark as Complete and then you realize you need to change an answer, or you answered something incorrectly, there's always the green Edit Form button, which you can go back to later. Also, something to keep in mind is that an asterisk indicates that you are required to answer a question. So generally speaking, required questions are also going to be in red text. So if you see red text and you see an asterisk, that is a question that you must answer, or the system will not let you save the form. And every time you complete a form or an individual component, you always want to be periodically clicking on that green Save Form button, and that will make sure that the answers that you just entered are saved. It's really important to do that periodically, to save early and to save often so that you don't lose work. The other thing I recommend, and when I go through the individual parts of the application, I'm going to highlight these, but certain sections have required documents that you have to upload, like a map or a copy of your purchase and sale agreement. And I recommend that you gather all of those ahead of time and have those ready to go, so that when you are moving through web grants, you have that document available to upload. Because in certain circumstances, if attaching the document is required, if it's an asterisk question, the system will not let you move forward and answer questions in different sections of the application until you upload that document. So it's going to give you a message that says it's not complete, you must upload. So another sort of tip to using web grants is to read the application ahead of time, those separate documents that we gave you, the Word version or the PDF version, and try to make sure you have all of the required attachments ready to go before you actually start the application and start editing it. And that will save you some time and frustration because you will get, you will hit a wall. It will let you move forward if you don't upload the required attachments. Do we have any web grants questions? This is the end of my sort of web grant section before I move into the parts of the application form itself. I really just tried to hit the highlights here. There's a lot more detail. And again, that step-by-step instruction guide that we have will walk you through a lot more than I just did, and it'll sort of give you examples of different question types you might have to answer in web grants and what those look like. So if you're not familiar with web grants, I definitely would recommend that you look at that step-by-step guide.
No questions so far, Wendy.
No questions. Okay. I'm going fast here. Next, I'm going to take some time to kind of go through the various elements of the application form and drill down into some specific questions. I would, I guess, tell you up front the screenshots that I'm going to include here of the application are taken from web grants. So when we go through this section, this will give you a good idea of sort of the interface that you will see when you log in and when you're working in your web grants application. The first application component is what we call the applicant project and property information section. This component requests basic information about your project, about the property, and about the applicant as well as the owner. You will need to answer questions about the location of the property, the project type, the owner's contact information, the applicant's contact information, the acreage and tax parcel data. There are also 3 narrative form questions, including a summary description of the project, why the property is important to your organization, and a description of the project location. I have provided some example answers on this slide to give you a sense of what we're looking for answers to these questions. There are also required attachments that you will need to upload as part of this section. And that includes items such as a recorded deed for prior acquisition projects, a purchase and sale agreement or a willing owner letter, and an aerial map that shows your project boundaries. Be sure to click the green Save Form button, which here is at the top right, as you complete the section. This applies through all the sections of the application. As I mentioned before, save early and save often. And then before I move on, the sort of the summary description of the project, just to kind of go through these examples, I like to refer to as the 5 W's. We just want to know who, what, where, when, and why. And an example here is when you're asked to describe your project, the example is the Eastern Battlefield Trust requests a grant to partially fund its acquisition of the 85-acre dogwood tract. This property is within the core and study areas of the 1st and 2nd dogwood battlefields. Both battlefields are documented United States colored troops sites important to African American and Civil War history. A grant would allow the Eastern Battlefield Trust to preserve this land and provide for public access through installation of interpretive signage and trails. That's the kind of basic summary we're looking for. It kind of gives our reviewers an overall sense of your project and why it's important. The other 2 narrative questions on this page kind of drill down a little bit more in the sense that we want to know why this is specifically important to your organization and possibly any partner organizations in the project. Here, the example is acquisition of the property will create a continuous 250-acre corridor of protected battlefield landscape owned by the Eastern Battlefield Trust. It's consistent with our mission to implement large landscape scale conservation projects. It is also the last unprotected piece of open space land on the dogwood battlefield. And finally, for the project location, here we're looking for any geographic features of note, such as a perennial stream or wooded cover, any roads that may bound the property, and any land use either on the property or adjoining that may be important for us to know to understand the property and its context. The example here is the property is located along Jones Lane and Dogwood Road in East County, Virginia. The land is currently unimproved and primarily wooded. The property contains 100 feet of frontage on Dogwood Run, a perennial stream, in addition to 45 acres of mature wooded cover and 0.86 acres of wetlands. It's surrounded by agricultural lands to the north and west and residential development to the south. So again, we're looking for answers that are sort of as concise as possible. There will be word limits within web grants for a lot of these questions, or character limits, but you should have sufficient space to kind of give us a paragraph about your project, why it's important, and the general location. The next section of the application is project eligibility. And here it's important to note that we only want you to select one battlefield if your property crosses multiple battlefields, which is the case in a lot of parts of the state. Please select one to highlight in your application. We recommend that you select the battle with the highest priority rating and the most core acreage because the scoring is geared toward that. However, keep in mind there are other narrative answer questions where you can note that the property intersects other battlefields as applicable. To the extent possible, please note in the answers in this section what battle actions occurred on the property and how this property contributes to the historic significance of the larger battlefield. Remember to attach the required map that shows the property boundaries in relation to the core and study areas for Civil War battlefields or the boundaries of a Revolutionary War or War of 1812 site. So again, we need a summary description of the battle, specific actions that occurred on the subject property, and how the property contributes to the significance of the larger battlefield. If it's a situation where perhaps you don't know enough about what specifically may have occurred on the tract, just indicate that in your answer. The next section focuses on the historic significance and integrity of the property. Here we ask you to oops, sorry, my finger hit that too fast. We ask you to describe any historic man-made battlefield features or sites, such as earthworks or buildings. And if you do indicate that there are those features on the property, you must attach supporting documentation supporting the presence of those features. And that might include things such as photographs or archaeological survey reports or a historic map that identifies those features. You will also have to describe the battlefield terrain and landscape, whether there are any historic resources greater than 50 years old on the property, but perhaps not associated with the battle. So there may be resources that predate the battle or postdate the battle, but they are still historically significant. And then we also would like to know if any of the resources on the property that are historic represent underrepresented communities. Well, that was a mouthful. Or whether there are any modern resources on the property, which would be those constructed or installed after 1976. Again, for underrepresented resources, you must also attach documentation supporting your answers, such as letters, primary sources, or scholarly articles. If you have more than one file to upload, there is an option in this section to include additional documentation. And at the very bottom of this section, there's a component called supporting documentation. So you can upload more than one document. One other item of note here is that to the extent the property is compromised by modern improvements, the applicant may be required to rehabilitate the property according to a specified plan. This would be developed as part of the easement application and drafting process. In the next section, we ask you to identify any other conservation values associated with the property, such as frontage on a scenic river or byway, or location within a heritage area. Be sure to answer yes or no to all the questions in the table and provide a brief description for any yes answers. So if the property, for example, is within the Journey Through Hallowed Ground National Heritage area, you would answer yes. And then in the description section, you would note Journey Through Hallowed Ground National Heritage Area. Finally, you must select whether the property falls within any Conserve Virginia categories. Conserve Virginia is that data is available through the Department of Conservation and Recreation's Virginia Natural Heritage Data Explorer website at the URL shown on the screen here. And if anyone has any questions on that, I'm happy to separately address them. If you're not sure how to go in there and look at the Conserve Virginia categories, I can help you with that. This is also a good resource if you want to get a map of conserved lands that are near your property. One of the questions will ask you to submit that an associated map, and you can get that information through this database as well. Public access and interest is the next application component. The first section asks you to indicate the number of days per year that the property will be physically accessible to the public. And this is going to be a drop-down menu question where you will get all the options that are written in italics on the screen here. For 365 days per year, or the 180 to 364 days per year category, this means the property is accessible to the general public without permission required. This is important to note because it doesn't mean visual access from a public right-of-way. It means that the members of the public may access the property without permission required. As another example, a roadside pull-off that only permits viewing a portion of a much larger property would not qualify for the 365-day per year public access. So think carefully about what your organization expects to practically achieve and use reasonable judgment when answering this question. And also be aware that we will ask you to provide documentation of the access or tangible steps that you've taken to achieve the access prior to grant closeout. The other question in this section asks you to identify and list with a short sort of timeline any planned site improvements that you will do to facilitate that public access. And again, consider things such as kiosks and trails, walking tours, signs or wayside panels, and roadside pull-offs, things like that. Continuing in public access, this is a larger section of the application. The remaining questions about public access and interest directly connect to the priorities that are laid out in our enabling legislation. They broadly focus on how associated communities will be impacted by the project, the level of community support, research opportunities related to preservation of the property, and heritage tourism benefits. Attach a minimum of 1, but no more than 3 letters of support. And keep in mind, if you submit multiple applications, please try to answer these questions based on the unique characteristics of the specific property. So just to highlight here, the other activities question is asking about activities planned to make information accessible to the public about the property. And then the second section is communities that are impacted, and asking you to please identify those and consider descendant communities, local preservation organizations, national organizations, friends groups, historical societies. Current community support is important to note how the communities that have been involved in the project, what communities have been involved in the project development, and how they will be involved in implementation. For research opportunities, describe how the project will further research opportunities and identify any areas of focus. Consider how the project will increase knowledge about the property's history, its archaeological resources, and describe how the project will accelerate development of heritage tourism experiences and stimulate investment in heritage tourism. In the uses and treatment of the property section, you will be asked to provide narrative answers to 4 questions. You must identify the current uses of the property and how those will change if funding is awarded. Describe plans for the stewardship, treatment, and maintenance of the property, especially its historic resources. Describe plans for any battlefield restoration or rehabilitation if it's applicable, and note if any non-historic buildings are planned to be removed, and describe the property's natural environment and plan stewardship strategies to address these resources. For example, if the property contains land in active agricultural use, note what this is, whether it is subject to a lease, and if agricultural BMPs or a conservation plan are in use. For threat, we want to know if the property is currently on the market for sale or has been in the past 12 months. Or if the property is threatened by proposed development or is in an estate being settled. It is critical that you attach sufficient documentation of threat to receive full points. Describe the nature, extent, and severity of the threat to the battlefield, specifically the property to be acquired or placed under easement, and explain how the project mitigates the severity of the threat. Tell us about any compelling needs for preservation that would give this project additional priority. Here, there are some required attachments, the MLS or real estate listing, an estate document if the property is currently in an estate being settled, or documents supporting a development threat, such as a zoning application or a permit. In general, we are seeking projects or properties with an active or immediate threat to their integrity or preservation. We're seeking projects that have the potential to protect a property with a high level of integrity, or projects that present a unique preservation opportunity. Next, you'll need to describe how your organization will manage the project to completion, including recordation of the easement. Here, we ask you to consider the economic viability of opening sites to the public and providing necessary visitor facilities as applicable. Be concise when listing goals and identifying the steps to complete the proposed project. Several examples of goals and a timeline are shown here, and the goal example just is to acquire the property, provide for public access through trails and signage, install roadside pull-off, connect property to the established greenway trail, and arrange for the friends group to provide tours. So something as brief as that is fine here. And you may only have a few goals. Here I provided 5 just to give you a sense. And the same applies to the timeline in the sense that we're looking for estimations or to understand, how much thought you may have given to this component. And if you don't have, a lot of activities planned yet, it's fine to say that and just note that they're not yet started. The remaining part of organizational capacity and goals addresses open projects from prior grant rounds. And we added this section last year. And we ask whether you have any open VBPF grants, the number of open grants you have, and whether you have been submitting the required progress reports in a timely manner. In this section, we are evaluating the applicant's prior performance. The scoring for this section incorporates only a reduction in points for lack of timely submittal of progress reports. So you won't be penalized if you have not previously managed a grant. In the legal matters and easement section, you must identify any known title issues and the steps being taken to resolve them, and any issues that need to be resolved before the easement can be recorded, such as the need to acquire an access easement, any environmental issues, or encroachments. With regard to attachments in this section, you must minimally upload a copy of the first easement acceptance committee review letter you have for your project. If the project has been through a second EAC review, include that as well as a board approval letter if you have it. So if you have those, attach them. It helps the reviewer to understand your project. If you include as many of those as applicable, and as I mentioned way at the beginning, this is one way we look at project readiness. If you have completed all three of those review levels for your easement application, then please attach those letters and let the reviewer know that. The other part of this section asks if the easement associated with your project conforms to the comprehensive plan. The choices here will be yes, yes with conditions, or no. Choose yes with conditions if the locality indicated in its letter that the easement will conform if it contains certain provisions. And we do see that fairly frequently. If you're not sure sort of where your letter falls in the yes with conditions, or no, feel free to ask me, and I can help you with that. Importantly, you must attach a letter or other correspondence from the locality indicating their response to whether the easement conforms to the comprehensive plan. And again, projects that don't conform to the plan at the time of the application will not be funded. And here we have the budget section, and I mentioned that this has changed from last year. We simplified this section. We took out some questions that were really not applicable. So here, all we're asking you to submit is your grant request amount, the appraised value of the property or the easement. And if you don't have that available, please provide a reasonable estimate. And then indicate your sources of match as you know them. And this is where we'll ask you if the match is not yet applied, whether you've applied, whether you've been awarded the match, or whether it's already been dispersed and you have it in hand. Attach a letter that I also mentioned earlier, demonstrating that you will obtain the match, and list the source of the funds as you know them at the time of the application. For the additional documentation section, you must submit at least 5, but no more than 10 photos. Digital photos, we recommend submitting all 10 if possible to give the reviewers a good sense of the property. I also encourage you to submit the optional attachments if you have them available. This includes a appraisal report, environmental site assessment, boundary survey, and a title commitment or a title insurance policy. As I mentioned, a full appraisal report is not required at the time of submission of an application, but if you have it included, or if you have a preliminary appraisal, submit that. Note again that if you are awarded funds, we may also, in addition to the appraisal report, ask for an update or appraisal review as applicable. Again, keep in mind, if you're awarded funds, you'll have to also meet the requirements of the DHR's easement program, and that includes, again, obtaining a boundary survey current within 1 year and a title policy. If you have a current boundary survey at the time of the application, please provide that, but we'll also happily look at a draft survey or an existing older survey if you have that as well. Depending on your project, you might also have a title commitment or title insurance policy for either the fee simple acquisition or the easement acquisition, and please include those as well. The last section of the application is for you to acknowledge and sign the form. You're certifying that you have reviewed the grant manual for 2026, that the information in the application is true and accurate to the best of your knowledge, and that you'll notify the program administrator, which is me, about any material changes. And you are also indicating that you are authorized to sign on behalf of your organization. So lastly, before I get to sort of the conclusions or questions and answers, I just wanted to take a minute to kind of give you some successful application tips, kind of highlighting some of the things that we've seen over grant cycles that may help direct you a little better. Make sure you reach out to all grant funders and project partners early in the process. So if you know you're going to work with the ABPP for match, reach out to them, or VLCF with DCR, and make sure you understand if any grant requirements conflict, and also if any deliverables can be combined. Often something that we may require for our grant program or for our easement program is similar to what another grant program may require if you're using I shouldn't say VLCF because that's state, I'm sorry, but if you're using another grant program as match, it's important to make sure that the programs and the timelines align. Carefully read the grant manual and application form, review the program and property protection requirements, including our easement template. And keep in mind that the application form and scoring criteria may change from one grant round to the next. In this cycle, as I mentioned, there were very few changes. We did modify that budget section to simplify it, but still make sure you read through everything so that you understand all the questions and what we are asking for. Answer narrative questions about project objectives and goals clearly and concisely. The more specific you can be about that particular project, the better. Understand costs, due diligence requirements, milestones and deadlines, as well as the timeline for disbursement of the funds and recordation of the easement. As I talked about earlier, attach up to 3 letters of support for the overall project and its public benefits. If there is a project partner, for example, if you're going to transfer the property after you acquire it to another organization or to a locality, it would be really helpful if you had a letter of support from that organization. And that will help our reviewers understand that that partner is aware of the project and is supportive of it and is potentially willing to accept the property in the future. Obviously, that may change, but it's important that we understand sort of the reviewers understand the throughput, and that if you do indicate you're transferring it, that the transferee is also supportive of the project. Public access, I did mention 365 days a year means that members of the public may access that property without permission every day of the calendar year. So think carefully before you select a public access answer and make sure that your plans actually align with what you're selecting. The other thing we see a lot is lack of consistency among answers. So ensure when you answer a question in one section that it's consistent with an answer in another question. For example, if you selected that the property will be open to the public 365 days a year, make sure the narrative responses in the public interest and access section explain how that will occur. Sometimes we see someone select 365 days a year, and then they answer a narrative question about public access saying the property will be open for limited tours. And if you sort of explain in your narratives how the 365 will be met, and maybe you're doing tours in addition to its accessible 365, just make sure that's clear so the reviewers understand what you're proposing. Another example of what we see a lot is inconsistency in the acreage. So the very beginning of the application asks you to put in acreage numbers, and sometimes we'll see in narrative answers or on the maps a different acreage number than what was submitted in the specific question that asks you acreage numbers. I know sometimes your survey acreage may differ from the GIS acreage, may differ from acreage that's in a deed. So just, I guess, pick one and be consistent, because a lot of times our reviewers get confused if a map has boundaries that are not consistent with an acreage that's listed, or if a narrative answer has an acreage number that's different from the project acreage that's identified. Again, provide clear maps that show the proposed boundary of the property, and don't assume the reviewer understands the property or its relationship to other conserved lands in the area. Again, if you have 2 easement acceptance committee reviews and a board of historic resources review, be sure to include all those letters. And finally, keep in mind that members of the grant review panel scoring the application will likely not know your project. So be sure to be clear and be concise. In terms of the application itself, we will notify you, I will notify you through web grants if your application is incomplete, or if for any reason there's an issue with something that was supposed to be uploaded, for example, or something that needs like a technical clarification, and I will notify you through web grants, and you will be given 2 business days to correct those errors. So our goal is to help you get your application as complete as possible, you know, and try to facilitate that as much as possible. So before I go to Q&A, I want to say thank you for listening to me talk for over an hour. There was a lot I tried to pack in there in a short amount of time. And as I said, we're going to try to post this recording. If it didn't come out well, I will likely just re-record it and get something up on our website, as well as on the web grants portal, going over what I've said today. But just to direct you in the future, if you have specific questions about the easement program or DHR's easement application process, please contact Carrie, who I introduced at the beginning. Carrie is our easement program specialist, and her email and her phone number are up on the screen here. Questions about the battlefield, Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund specifically, you can direct to me. And again, if you have questions about whether your property, your project property falls within the boundaries of a battlefield or is a Revolutionary War of 1812 site, you can reach out to our archives, and their phone number is on the screen there. That's 804-482-6440. And if you want, you can also reach out to me. I may also forward you to them depending on the question. And finally, I've included again our web grants portal address, which is vadhr.webgrantscloud.com. And one final thought I had that I neglected to mention at the beginning is the budget that just passed. The Battlefield Fund does have the 5.25 million in the current year, and then we will have 5.25 million again next year. This year's fund is, as I mentioned, higher because we have some carryover funds from last year. But if you aren't able to meet the parameters or requirements for this grant cycle, know that we will be doing another grant round this time next year, and you can plan ahead for that as well. So that's all I had. Carrie, are there any questions, or I guess anybody, we can try to unmute you if you have questions, or you can put them in the chat.
We had one question from Mark Perot. He would like to know, this is a more general question, what is the impact of an overhead power line corridor crossing a 41-acre tract that is otherwise completely forested and pristine? Unfortunately, we don't know how wide that corridor is. So if you'd like to address that.
I'm guessing if it's a power corridor, it's probably a couple hundred feet. It might have more than one utility co-located in it. That's a difficult question to answer without seeing the property in its context. I would say that's definitely not a property we would exclude from consideration. We have some properties and projects where we've worked with utility corridors to sometimes to come up with a plan, also to facilitate, for example, a pollinator habitat in the corridor, or other ways to kind of mitigate a little bit the impact to the landscape. So I definitely would apply. And when we look at that, I guess the other question would be whether that corridor sort of cuts through the middle. Is it on the edge? What is the impact to the overall battlefield landscape? Are some of the questions we would consider. And then secondary to that, it sounds again like it's a power corridor. Those are fairly standard in the sense that we know generally from other properties what rights the utility may have in that area. But if it's something unique or different in terms of that utility's pre-existing rights, we would take that into consideration as well. Sometimes we've asked for corridors to be excluded from an easement or from a project, but that really depends on the specific provisions of that individual easement in that corridor. As well as any plans that may be on the books for changes in the corridor, whether there's a new line or a heightened line or something like that planned to go in. So there are a lot of factors we would look at, but I definitely would say, Mark, it's not something that we'll say no to just because of the corridor. We will definitely look at it, kind of keeping all of those other thoughts and considerations in mind.
Mark, I have disabled your mic if you have, or I have enabled your mic, sorry, if you have any follow-up questions for Wendy.
I think he would also have to unmute on his end as well.
Yes. Okay, and Kathy Robertson has asked a question on public access. If a roadside pull-off is not considered public access, how much of a property needs to be accessible to qualify? How many trails would be needed? Would there be a requirement of X number of feet of trails?
So I think the idea here is if you have a really large property, like there's no hard and fast thresholds there, Kathy. I think what we don't want to see is a roadside pull off for, as an example, 100 or 150 acre property where you can't really see all of the property from the roadside pull off or get a sense of the battlefield activity that occurred. So I don't think we need to sort of micromanage that answer too much. That's why I think I said kind of use reasonable judgment, but a roadside pull-off is public access, yes, but I'm not sure. I think the idea here is that it's not necessarily considered 365 days a year if members of the public cannot actually understand and access all of the property. So that public access might be considered less than 365 days a year. It would definitely meet, depending on, again, the circumstances, the easement's also going to require 2 days of public access. But I think the idea was to give you as the applicant some better parameters or some things to think about when you select a public access option. Don't necessarily select 365 if the roadside pull-off is showing a smaller portion of a larger property that is not going to be accessible. And it may be that geography impacts or topography impacts seeing, those 100 or 150 acres. A smaller parcel that's not going to be as much of an impact, particularly if it's level and if the primary, elements of the battle or the other conservation values are able to be seen from and understood from the roadside pull-off. I hope that helps. So it's a bit of a judgment call, and it's more going, it's more making sure that when you select a response to that question, when you tell us how you're going to implement it and what the steps are, that you're consistent in your narrative answers with what you selected. So it's really going to somewhat depend on the property.
He says, thank you. That really helped.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to throw up a terrible red flag there. But it just was an example of things we've seen and just to really consider it. And it's better for you to maybe go one notch down and say it's not 365 a year and maybe you get 2 fewer points. But we'd rather be more realistic and practical to what the public on the ground will see and experience, if that helps. And if you're still not sure, Kathy, you can ask me. And just so you all know, I didn't say this either. I don't actually score the applications. I'm a neutral party, so I will review them for accuracy and for completeness and let you know if elements are missing. But I am not on the review panel. I'm not someone who is scoring and commenting on the application. So feel free to ask me questions, and I'll do my best to help you get answers if you're unsure.
That's all our questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you all. I appreciate your time today. And as I mentioned, please feel free to reach out. The applications are due September 1st. With web grants, I also encourage you to start early. Don't wait until the day before. We do not have the ability to accept late applications. So if you don't get it in by 5 p.m. on September 1st, it will not be submitted in time. So don't wait until a day or two before to start that process. Thank you, Carrie. I appreciate your help. And I look forward to talking with some of you as you work through your applications. And again, let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.